if we're ready to go. So firstly, I'd like to thank Conrad very much for agreeing to do this talk this evening on the subject of the origin of Freemasonry, something I'm sure we're all very much looking forward to. And having heard Conrad speak on several occasions in the past, I think we're going to be in for a real treat.
Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this presentation. I've started with an illustration from a 13th century manuscript, which shows the great architect of the universe having described a perfect circle, and here God, with the compasses in his hands, has created the sun and the moon and is about to change this unformed matter into the earth. This is a 13th century manuscript, but of course, Masonry goes much further back than that. And in fact, we can cover about 4,500 years of history very quickly, I have to say. So I'm not going to labour the point. So I'll start with one of the two origins of Freemasonry, which is the construction industry or the building trade. And I'm going to show you here probably the most famous building from the ancient world, one of the seven wonders of the world, the Great Pyramid at Giza. An amazing feat of planning, organisation and engineering, and a real tribute to the stonemasons' art and craft, still standing now after 5,500 years. And look at the size of these blocks on the left here compared with the human form. So that's one of the origins of Freemasonry. The other is, of course, scripture, and in particular, the books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Kings, etc. These form the historical setting for the 3 craft degrees and the Royal Arch. And they describe how Moses led the Israelites out of captivity by receiving the 10 Commandments. And if you see here, there's this wonderful picture of Charlton Heston in the film, The 10 Commandments. If you've not seen it, I would certainly recommend it. And it describes how Moses led the Israelites through the Dead Sea by parting the waters, or God parted the waters, and he later received the 10 Commandments. These commandments were in the form of tablets of stone, and they were put in a chest or a box called the Ark of the Covenant. And it was the first movable temple to God, and what's known in scripture as the tabernacle in the desert. And the story of Masonry goes further because, of course, these tablets in the Ark were placed here in Solomon's Temple, one of the most magnificent structures in the world. And of course, those of you in the Royal Arch will know that that temple was destroyed and eventually rebuilt under the rule of Zerubbabel. But what about the building industry in Britain? Well, we've had building going on here for thousands of years, Stonehenge and the Romans, etc. But the stone building industry, and we're talking here about stonemasons, the stone building industry in England really starts with the conquest, with the Norman conquest. We all know the story. Harold is defeated by Duke William. King Harold is defeated by Duke William at the Battle of Hastings. And this is the famous picture from the Bayeux Tapestry, which is coming to Britain in later this year. Certainly you ought to go and see it if you've got any interest in history. The Bayeux Tapestry Accords, of course, the death of Harold, and here he is, poor chap, getting it in the eye. Harold, king, is killed, interfectus est. Well, William wins the battle, gains the day, and he becomes William the Conqueror. Now, he's not the conqueror just because he wins the Battle of Hastings, but because he subjugated the entire Anglo-Saxon population. Most of the nobility were killed at the battle, and all of the land was acquired by King William now, and he divvied it out amongst henchmen. But to secure his property, he had to do two things. He had to start stone building. First of all, castles. Here you can see the famous Norman castle, the Tower of London, the White Tower as it's called. And secondly, cathedrals. These were enormous structures which towered above anything that had been seen in Anglo-Saxon England. And of course, the purpose was twofold. The castle scared the hell out of the local population on this earth, and the cathedral was designed to do the same for the next. But in order to build these castles, Norman power required skilled men who could design structures, men who could organize materials, who could build foundations and span covered spaces. So what did these men look like? Well, here is a picture, an illustration from a book called the Bedford Book of Hours. It was given to King Henry VI by the Duke of Bedford in 1430. And it's an illustrated devotional book. And this is meant to be the building of the Tower of Babel. This is a famous story from the Old Testament, but it's not the purpose of why I'm putting it here. The purpose of why I'm showing it here for you is to show here we are. This is a contemporary illustration of stonemasons at work. If you look here in the left-hand corner, you can see two very distinguished gentlemen. This almost certainly is the patron of the building, the one who commissioned it. You can see by his ermine and his very elegant gowns. And he is talking to a rather grudging individual, and this is almost certainly the master mason, the person who did the building. And above him here, you can see this workman making mortar. Mortar is a mix of sand and lime and water, and is the ingredient to not glue, but make sure that stones fit together. It doesn't fix the stones together, but it nevertheless enables the stones to fit together. A very important part of stonemasonry. And on the other side, you can see here this rather curious looking animal, which looks to me like a camel, but I suspect it's somewhere between a camel and a horse. And obviously stones have arrived for the building, and these stones are then offloaded from the camel and then winched up by a rather primitive form of Lewis, as you can see here, winched right up to the higher levels. And here, very importantly, in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see two highly skilled masons at work. And you can tell that they're craftsmen because of their clothes. The one in the green is putting the finishing touches to some carving. And the one in the blue, the magnificent blue tunic there you can see a square and a compass. And you can also see around various instruments that are used to cut stone. So there's an illustration of, if you like, a contemporary illustration of what the stonemasons did. But you can also use your own eyes. Now on the left, you can see the familiar image of Exeter Cathedral. With its magnificent towers and the west front and the screen. It all looks, does it not, as if it's all made of one stone. It looks homogeneous, and yet when you look at what the constituents are, you can see here it's made of up to 10 different stones, most of which have been put in order to repair earlier stones. But you can see here the predominant colour is orange, which is Salcombe, and yellow, which is beer. Now we know all this because the science of photogrammetry, which is what the archaeologists and the stonemasons now do, that enables them to be able to determine where the stone came from. So this is modern technology at work. But we also have records. We have building records from Exeter Cathedral, building records that go from the late 13th century up to the early 16th century. And these building records tell us where the money came from, largely the clergy, and how it was spent on men and materials. These buildings were not built for nothing. You needed money in order to build them. And in the case of a cathedral, it was usually financed by the clergy. Well, this picture that you can see here is an illustration of what the records show of where the stone came from. The records show that two of the most important mines were in East Devon, here at Salcombe Regis, the Salcombe stone I mentioned earlier, and at Beer. Basically what happened was the stone was dragged to the coast, put on barges, and then taken round the coast, past Exmouth Point, up the River Exe, and I've lost it, and landed at Topsham, and then it would have been dragged all the way into Exeter. To give you some idea of the size of the stones, this is a very interesting photograph from 1890 outside Beer Quarry Caves. Look at the size of these stones, almost the size of a horse. Now in these days they would have used oxen, but nevertheless these are huge stones. And this is the sort of thing that the stonemasons would have carved. This is a new pinnacle, newish pinnacle, carved about 10 years ago by the stonemasons of Exeter. And you can see here these wonderful carvings, one of which is of an Indian chief, the Chiefs, the rugby team, famous rugby team of Exeter. And you can also go to Beer Quarry Caves if you want to. They're open during the summer. And you can see the stonemasons work. So that's, if you like, tells us a little bit about the stonemasons. So what else do we know? Well, here we come to the most important document of Freemasons, and it is called, or this is one of many documents, and they're all called the Old Charges. And there are over 100 of these documents, and they all set out the regulations or ritual for stonemasons. What should the masters, the craftsmen, and the apprentices do? What shouldn't they do? This one here is probably the most famous one. It's called the Halliwell manuscript, or the Regius poem. Regius because it was given to the nation by King George II, GR2, in 1757, and is housed in the British Library. And it's the earliest known record of how stonemasons did their job, not their physical job, but how they were organized and what sort of rules and regulations they obeyed. And it starts famously with this phrase, "Here begins the constitutions of the art of geometry according to Euclid." And it then goes on to lay out a history of how masonry was created in Egypt and how it spread to other countries, including England. Now, here we're talking about stonemasonry, remember, we've not yet got to Freemasonry. It was probably written by a clerk, a man in holy orders, because it's written partly in Latin and partly in Old English. But it finishes with a prayer, which should, I think, be to bring an echo to everyone, because it says, Amen, Amen, so mote it be, so say we all for charity. So what does it actually contain? Well, it consists of a set of rules, and they're in two parts. The articles are for the Master Masons. And I'll give you some examples here of the sort of thing that the old charges, the Hallowell manuscript, contains. Every Master Mason must attend the general congregation unless excused. No master shall take an apprentice for less than 7 years. No bondsman may become an apprentice in case his lord should try to recover him. No master is to harbour a mason who is a thief or robber. No mason shall disparage another's work. The master must give full instruction, and he shall be responsible during the apprenticeship. Now, this should, I hope, stir some echoes in your Masonic mind of the sort of phraseology that we use today when we are summoned to attend a lodge. This is a general congregation. The ancient charges read to the master-elect. You agree to be a good man and true, and strictly obey the moral law. The questions to the candidate: are you a free man and of the age of 21 years? In other words, you're not a bondsman. And there's also here, that's quite appropriate for the audience that we're in here, there is a lot of mentoring and education going on. The master must give full instruction, and he shall be responsible during the apprenticeship. You remember the phrase in the 3rd degree, by your instruction and our own industry, we hope to find, etc., etc. So, that's the rules for the Master Masons. What about the rules for the apprentices? Again, I've just illustrated some of them here. The Mason shall swear to God and uphold the church, the saints, and his masters and fellows. He shall swear to do an honest day's work, the wages paid. The apprentice shall swear to keep secret the master's teaching and whatever he hears or sees done in the lodge. The next one might amuse you. The mason shall not lie with his master's wife or daughter, nor with his fellow's wife or daughter, nor with his fellow's concubine. And the last one on the list, the mason shall swear to be true to his master, the craft, and the king. If any man break his oath, he shall be brought before the assembly. Well, if you look at the Book of Constitutions, the aims and relationships of the craft, a belief in a supreme being is essential and admits of no compromise. In these days, the days we're talking about here, everyone was Catholic. Hence, a mason shall swear to love God and uphold the church, the saints, etc. We have obligations in the various degrees to keep secret. The apprentice shall swear to keep secret the master's teaching. And of course, all this is reinforced by the questions to the candidate: in whom do you put your trust? In God. So, back up again. So, these are illustrations from this wonderful document, series of documents called the Old Charges. For nearly 300 years, the stonemasons were the most technically proficient of all the crafts and trades in England. Now we come to the 16th century. Now, in the 16th century, huge developments take place. By 1500, church building in England was on the decline. there weren't many more cathedrals being built. So the requirement for the stonemason's craft was diminished. Henry VIII breaks with Rome and dissolves the monasteries. This is Rievaulx Abbey. Some of you may have seen it in Yorkshire. Cromwell, this is Thomas Cromwell, by the way, Henry's henchman. Cromwell just advised the king that the monasteries were dissolute, so they were dissolved. And Henry thought he was going to make rich plunderings here. And Cromwell, of course, to make sure the deed was done properly, he dispatched all of the monks and the nuns, and he basically took the roofs of these buildings. And any mason will tell you that once you take the roof off a building, it will deteriorate very quickly. So the stonemasons who had been employed on all these buildings, either building new ones or repairing the old ones, had to seek other employment, such as carpentry, plastering, house building, etc. But that's the negative side. What about the positive side of the Tudor period? Well, this illustration here is the frontispiece to Henry's Bible, the Great Bible. Henry commanded that the Bible should be placed in every church in the land. And this one act of placing the Bible in the church, but in English, meant that everyone could hear Scripture every Sunday, every high day, every holy day. And it went to the very heart of the way we speak. And we have the wonderful imagery of the Old Testament and the New Testament, the proverbs, the parables, the heroes, the villains, the words, the rhymes, and all of the things that I've been talking about earlier. The dividing of the Red Sea, the building of Solomon's temple, etc., etc. So comprehension and literacy in England started to dramatically improve. And the other thing, of course, that was developing, and Ruben touched upon this in earlier webinars, was, of course, the study of grammar. And grammar was taught, along with the other liberal arts and sciences, in grammar schools, hence the name grammar schools. And of course, the most famous pupil of grammar schools was William Shakespeare, who was born in 1564 and died in 1616. So we start to see in the 16th century huge improvements in education, literacy, and knowledge. So when we come to the next century, the 17th century, further improvements took place. There was still less stone building, but people started to study the theoretical side of geometry. And this, of course, is the famous Pythagoras' theorem. We'll come back to it in a minute, but to refresh your memory from your schoolboy geometry, in any right-angled triangle, the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares in the other two sides. So if you have a triangle of 5, of 3, and of 4, 5 5s are 25, 3 3s are 9, 4 4s are 16, 16 plus 9 equals 25. A beautiful theory. And educated men who were now going to universities, not just to grammar schools, started to learn about the theoretical side of geometry, not just the practical side. And they started also getting interested in architecture. And we start to see the gentleman architects. So, for example, Inigo Jones builds the banqueting house, Vanbrugh builds the Blenheim Palace, and above all, Christopher Wren designs St. Paul's Cathedral, following the Great Fire of 1666. Now, these designs, based on architectural principles, these designers, these architects, needed stonemasons. You can't build something just from a plan. You need to have the skilled people in order to do it. So we start to see in the 17th century stonemasons whose lodges were still going in existence, meeting periodically. These stonemasons started to meet up with gentlemen who were interested in what the stonemasons did, but their interest came from the theoretical side of geometry and architecture. And then in this century, we start to see the first recorded instance of an initiation. Elias Ashmole, this incredible gentleman here on the left, he is, as you can see, extremely well dressed. He is what's called the Windsor Herald. He was an official of the Order of the Garter. So we're talking about somebody who was very, very well connected indeed to King Charles II. He was a grammar school boy himself, and he kept a diary. And there are two instances in the diary which are both references to Masons. In 1646, he records that I was made a Freemason at Warrington in Lancashire with Colonel Henry Mannering, who was his brother-in-law. The names of those that were then at the lodge were Richard Penkett, Warden, Mr. James Collier, and the names of 5 others. So clearly, lodges were in existence at this time. And here we have this gentleman being received or admitted or accepted into a lodge. In other words, a free and accepted Mason. And then there's a gap of about 35 years, and then he kept his diary going, but he doesn't make any mention of Freemasonry. But then in 1682, he makes another entry. I received a summons to appear at a lodge to be held the next day at Mason's Hall, London. I was a senior fellow among them, it being 35 years since I was admitted. We all dined at the Half Moon Inn Tavern at Cheapside at a noble dinner prepared at the charge of the new accepted Masons. So perhaps we could reintroduce that. We might not get too many new initiates if we do. Anyway, so that was Elias Ashmole. Now, what sort of ceremony might Ashmole have experienced? Well, one of the things that bedevils Masonry is the lack of information, the lack of primary evidence. But there are records, and in the 1930s, a document was discovered relating to Masonic practice, Freemasonry practice, going back to the middle of the 17th century. In other words, the time that Ashmole was initiated. It's on a piece of paper that was folded up and put in his pocket, and it contains ritual that would have been familiar to us. So, for example, and this is a slightly later French illustration, but this paper document describes the fact that the initiate knelt before the Bible. He took his oath. You can see here, just about see the square and compasses. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, it was the custom of Masons, and here we're starting to evolve into Freemasons from the operatives. As I said, the operatives mixed with the gentlemen, and we get this concept of free and accepted Masons. The general meeting place for Freemasons in the early 18th century was in the pubs. And here we have an illustration from a famous engraver, William Hogarth, of a very good night that had been had. Here you can see 2 gentlemen, and this gentleman with the wig and the hat and this huge apron is the master of a lodge, because around his neck you can see here the square, and he's being escorted home by another gentleman with a wig, and this is clearly the Tyler because he's got a sword, and they've been making a bit of a racket, so much so that they've woken up the whole street, much to the disgust of this person on the upper level who decides to empty the chamber pot on them. So much for masonry in the early 18th century. Well, by the end of 1716, a group of lodges had got together and they decided to do some extraordinary things. They decided to create the Premier Grand Lodge. There were 4 of these lodges, and they were all based more or less round where Great Queen Street headquarters is now. There was one in St Paul's Churchyard, one in Drury Lane, one in Covent Garden, and the other was in Westminster. And they met the following year at this inn now, which is gone. It's the Goose and Gridiron. You can see the Goose there and the Gridiron, very famous pub in those days. And they assembled there. They elected a Grand Master, Anthony Sale, a gentleman. And the purpose of the Premier Grand Lodge in 1717, and this jewel, by the way, is what many of us wear to commemorate the 300th anniversary. The purpose of this entity, this Premier Grand Lodge, the first Grand Lodge in existence, was to elect a Grand Master, which they did, to have quarterly meetings, quarterly communications, which we still have, and an annual assembly and feast. It operated within about a 2-mile radius, and it had a very hazy authority over London lodges and their members. A few years after this, the Grand Lodge decided that it was time to put some regulation into effect. So a document was created, which is really the second most important document for Freemasons. The first being the old charges. The second is this one, and it's called the Constitutions of 1723. And this is the frontispiece. I'll come on in a minute about what's contained in there. But if you look here, you can see that this gentleman, this very gorgeously dressed gentleman, is presenting his credentials and his seals of office. He's presenting it to his successor. And this is the Duke of Montagu, who was the Grand Master in 1721, presenting to his successor, the Duke of Wharton, the seals of his office. And he's surrounded by his officers. Here you can see various pillars representing the 5 orders of architecture. It's not easy to see, but this is the parting of the Red Sea, which of course is part of Moses and the flight of the Israelites from Egypt. And here you've got the ancient god Apollo, the god of the sun. Of course, the sun is so important as a Masonic symbol. But then look at what's in the bottom here, and I've expanded it up here, Pythagoras' theorem again. And of course, this is the symbol which adorns the past master of a lodge. This one document, the Constitutions of 1723, was rewritten 15 years later, but this document had the biggest influence on world Freemasonry and went forth to every country in the world and transmitted the principles and tenets and encouraged brethren to form lodges on the English pattern. So what did it contain? Well, here's some examples. And there are many of them, but I've only quoted a few of them. A Mason is obliged to obey the moral law. He will never be a stupid atheist nor an irreligious libertine. A Mason is a peaceable subject to the civil powers and is never to be concerned in plots and conspiracies against the peace and welfare of the nation. No brother can be a warden until he has passed the part of a fellowcraft, nor a master until he has acted as a warden. You may enjoy yourself with innocent mirth, but avoiding all excess. No private piques or quarrels must be brought within the door of the lodge, far less any quarrels about religion or nations or state policy. Now, this is clearly the ancestor of so much of what we do today. The first charge concerning God and religion was a substitute for the old charges where everyone was expected to be a Catholic, but here, of course, you were meant to believe in God. So this encompassed Catholics and Jews and others. It also contains some other things that I think may have an echo with many of you, and that is there's all sorts of songs. And I will try at this point to try and sing this, and as I do so, I'm sure you will all recollect this. Come, let us prepare, we brothers that are assembled on merry occasion. Let's drink, laugh, and sing, our wine has a spring. Here's a health to an accepted Mason. Now, many of you may have heard this in the past, and there are lots of verses. And then at the end, we all stand up, we join each other's hands, and then we sing, then join hand in hand, by each brother firm stand. Let's be merry and put a bright face on. What mortal can boast so noble a toast as a free and an accepted Mason? Should bring an echo to many of you, I hope. Now, these constitutions were meant to be read in their entirety to every candidate. Well, that would have taken many hours, so I suspect that they abbreviated quite a lot of that. Well, we move on. That's, if you like, the rules and regulations. What about the symbolism? Well, I said earlier that Freemasons met in taverns, in pubs. And in the early days, the tiler chalked out on the floor of the room they were in the semblance of a lodge. And then at the end, he had to wash it away. Well, clearly, meeting in taverns meant that they had to remove all evidence of this from the uninitiated, and a lot of tavern innkeepers got fed up with this. So lodges thought, well, it might be better to have a cloth. And here's an example of an early cloth from 1760s. And then they thought, well, the cloths probably are not durable, so then we get boards. And here, of course, we have probably the most famous illustrator of tracing boards, John Harris, who is famous for the various different boards that he created, one of which, of course, is in the Emulation Ritual Book, a copy of which. So, what sort of ceremonies would be taking place at this time? Well, here is a French illustration, sorry, an English illustration of a French initiation, probably sometime in the 1740s. You can see here is the master. Here are the wardens. And here the deacon is bringing the candidate into a room. And here is the tracing board. But unfortunately, we have a real problem with early Masonic records. There are few things in Masonic history that are more perplexing than the question of how the degrees came into existence. The best we can say is that before 1717, there was only one ceremony worked, which roughly would comprehend to the first and second degrees. Some lodges were doing 2 degrees, some were doing 3, but the majority would have done 2 in one ceremony. So you went from being an entered apprentice to a fellow craft in one evening. Premier Grand Lodge, that had been founded in 1717, didn't control matters, certainly in the matter of ritual. Lodges could do what they liked. There were probably some form of uniformity, but not much else. Now we come to probably one of the biggest problems that the Premier Grand Lodge met in the 18th century. Premier Grand Lodge was created in 1717, but it started to make changes. It basically said it wanted to move lodges away from the requirement of being Christian to a requirement in a belief in God. It also changed the recognition words. So the B became J and the J became B. And a group of Masons said, well, hang on a minute. How can an ancient landmark suddenly be changed just at the whim of our lodge? And also at this time, many lodges were working another degree, a fourth degree. And things got so bad that a rival Grand Lodge was formed in 1750-51, not long after the formation of the Premier Grand Lodge. And it worked a fourth degree. By this time, the Premier Grand Lodge was working 3 degrees, a first, a second, and a third. But the rival Grand Lodge was working 4 degrees. And the 4th degree would be what we would now call the Royal Arch ceremony. Now, things got so bad that the 2 groups wouldn't talk to each other. And the new Grand Lodge felt that it was adhering to the ancient principles and the ancient landmarks. So it took on the name of the Ancients, even though it was the younger of the 2, and referred rather disparagingly to the older Grand Lodge as the Moderns. Well, this was a recipe for strife, and 60 years of strife occurred until, under this man here, the Duke of Sussex, who was one of the sons of King George III, he was the Grand Master, he came up with a compromise, and it's called the Sussex Fudge, and the compromise was that pure ancient masonry consists of 3 degrees. Those are the entered apprentice, the fellowcraft, and the master mason, including the supreme order of the Holy Royal Arch. So compromise was reached. The 2 parties came together amicably, and we have the Act of Union. And here is the original document, which was signed by Edward, Duke of Kent, and Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex, representing the 2 rival Grand Lodges, and the new arms came together. And so United Grand Lodge is the union of these 2 separate Grand Lodges. And if you want to learn more about all this, the best place to go is to the museum in London, where there's some wonderful exhibits. Here's a Lawrence's painting of King George IV, who was a Mason, and all sorts of other things. There's an incredible amount of things there, and anyone can visit. It's open 5 days a week, Tuesday through to Saturday. And it's also got a wealth of other information. All sorts of things are consulted, genealogy, etc., etc. So there we are, brethren. I've given you now a summary of 4,500 years and roughly how Freemasonry came into existence. And at this point, I'm going to stop sharing and hand you back to Steve and Gareth.
That's great. Thanks, Conrad. That was really, really interesting. Does anyone have any questions? Sure, there must be some.
Yes, can I have one?
Yep. Who was that?
Clive Pigeon.
Yep,
I'm
please do.
Very good talk. Thank you, Conrad. Very interesting. I got disturbed in the middle of it because I had to take a phone call, but it was only for 2 minutes, and I hope you didn't answer the question I'm about to ask. What is the significance of the Rosslyn Chapel?
Well, this relates to the Knights Templar, and there is a legend that some Knights Templars escaped. You may know that the Order of the Knights Templar was dissolved by King Philip IV of France, and the poor old Grand Master was burnt at the stake, Jacques de Molay. And there is a legend that some Masons escaped, Knights Templars escaped and took with them the secrets of the Knights Templar, and they are deposited in the Rosslyn Chapel. I have to say it's highly contentious, and the Masonic historians argue like hell over it, as they do on nearly all aspects of this. So the significance of it is it's a legend relating to perhaps some secrets, but I'm not sure whether I can add any more than that.
No, well, thank you very much. That's quite enough. Thank you. That's great.
Thanks, Conrad. Andrew Workman, you had your hand up next.
I did. Thank you again. Thank you, Conrad, for that lecture. The Article of Union of 1817. Where is it kept, and is it on display so we can go and see it?
Yes, it's 1813, Andrew. 1817 was Supreme Grand Chapter. It's 1813. Yes, in the museum there are copies of it. You can also see it online. It basically is a shortened version of the rule book. If you look at the console, I haven't got one here, but if you look at the UGLE Constitution and Rule Book, you will see in there a lot of what's in this document. But if you go to the museum, they will have displays of it. I can also, Andrew, show you a link where you can actually read the whole thing if you want to.
You say the Grand Lodge Museum has got copies. Where is the original kept?
In Grand Lodge. It's owned by Grand
Lodge.
Lodge. Yes, it's whether they've got the actual one out on display, I don't know, but certainly there are facsimiles of the 1723 constitutions, and there are facsimiles of the Act of Union, and the originals probably don't see the light of day because any documents like that get destroyed by light. The old charges, some of which are owned by the Freemasons, but the Halliwell manuscript, the Regis poem, is housed in the British Library, as is the Cook manuscript.
Thanks, Conrad.
Thank you.
Reuben, you were next.
Yeah, hi, Conrad, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Conrad, I don't think it would have been possible to summarize 4,500 years of complex history more clearly than in that talk. Many congratulations. But my question is, when do you think it was that we first started using the tools in Freemasonry in a symbolic sense, and when we started to think of the building of King Solomon's Temple in terms of building a temple in your heart or your soul or in society or whatever? When do you think that transition occurred?
Well, I think the building of King Solomon's Temple is there in the 1723 regulations, so it must have been used as an example before that, long before that. The old charges, which, as I said earlier, give a history of how Masonry evolved from Egypt, how geometry was used to measure the silt from the Nile, and how Euclid taught geometry to the priests and their sons, and then how those skills were spread to Israel, King Solomon, and then on to France and England. So I think the answer to your question is that King Solomon's Temple has been a fundamental part of stonemasonry and Freemasonry for, nearly 800 years, 700 years, possibly longer. The tools is a more difficult one. And the problem with the tools is that the document I showed you, the Edinburgh House manuscript, which is the earliest manuscript, doesn't mention tools at all. And in fact, I don't think tools get much of a mention until rituals start to appear. And the first rituals, emulation, stability, these sort of rituals start to appear as a result of the Union. When the Union took place, Grand Lodge started to exert a bit of authority over rituals, and it decided to hold teaching classes, lessons in how rituals should be conducted. And I think it's from then that we start to see the use of the tools, but the evidence is very hard to find. It's easier to say, yes, King Solomon's Temple's always been there, but the tools, different thing altogether. Now, one thing I would add that you didn't ask, but is very important to understand, is that the third degree, and I know there are one or two people here who are not Master Masons, so I won't go into any great detail, but the third degree is a late entrant to all of this. It wasn't practiced before 1700 and starts to suddenly appear in the 1720s. Was it invented, or was it an evolved thing that came back earlier? It's a subject for another discussion, but the third degree did not exist as we know it much before 1720, 1725. A long answer, Ruben, sorry to your question.
No, that's really helpful, Conrad. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. We are short on time, so if we could rattle through, we've got a few people asking questions still. Ben, you were next.
I hope everyone can hear me because I can't work out the video. It's not so much a question. We mentioned the museum at Grand Lodge, and for all those that haven't been, it is an exceptionally informative little tour. But all those that are looking perhaps to find out information about their own particular lodge, the librarian, you can email and ask questions about your own personal lodge and the history, particularly if you're involved in writing up a lodge history for a centenary or something like that. They can provide copies of original documents that you may not know exist, but relate to the founding of your particular lodge and all other information that they do hold in their central library on your lodge. So it was a plug really for the librarian at the museum. Useful resource if you know his email address and can email him. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Ben.
Well, Ben, a word of warning to everyone. If you think that this is a repository of all the documents you've never seen before, you might be a bit disappointed, because when I consulted for my own lodge, the Lodge of Union 444, I found one piece of paper. That was all that was kept. They won't let you see anything that's less than 100 years old. They didn't keep summonses, but the one piece of paper that they did have was absolutely amazing. It was the original petition to create the Lodge of Union in 1837. It was handwritten, and it's a priceless thing. So it was worth a trip. But
they sent me the that petition and all the signatures and how much they paid and what the reasons for setting up your lodge were. Absolutely fascinating if you like that sort of thing.
Excellent. Thank you. Pete Beasley, you were next. Very briefly.
Hi, Conrad. Fantastic and informative lecture. My question is, do we know of, or do we have any of the ancient minutes from any of the meetings that the Grand Lodge would have held from the 18th century, 18th century?
Yes and no. If you go back before Premier Grand Lodge, the Scots were very good at keeping minutes. So there are minutes of some of the Scottish lodges. There are minutes of the Premier Grand Lodge, but there are gaps there. There are not many minutes of English lodges before 1680, something like that. The Scots were well ahead of us in that respect. So it's mixed. As with all this subject, you're snatching at straws. You're trying to piece together little bits of information. So the answer is yes and no. There are some minutes, and certainly some of the very old lodges, like the Grand Steward's lodges, some of them have got minutes going way back before 1700, but there are gaps. The time immemorial lodges given up on trying to establish when they were founded. Some information's there, a lot isn't.
Brilliant. Thank you. Mike Sandel?
Thank you, Conrad. That was fascinating stuff. 2 points, really. One, to hear about the education of Masons at that point. A lot of them, before English cathedrals were built, there would have been European cathedrals, and those Masons would have been itinerant workers, really. They would have come over. So would the natural language at that time have been Latin? And secondly, I really did enjoy the Hogarth painting. That reminds me of the things we do after our installation, which is coming up in April.
Well, that's an interesting question you've raised, Mike, because certainly when William the Conqueror embarked on his building campaign, there weren't many skilled masons, so they had to be imported from France, which was ahead of us. And if you look at some of the great French cathedrals, they are masterpieces of architecture and stonemasonry. What language they would use, I don't know. I don't think it would have been Latin. To speak Latin, you would have had to have been very educated. I suspect that they spoke French and they used sign language, because an awful lot of what you can do in stonemasonry, if you describe to people what it is you're trying to do, then it's a very visual subject. So I suspect they spoke French. The trainee masons, we're talking about 11th, 12th century, the trainee masons would have spoken English, and then gradually the two groups would have mixed. I'm speculating here because I don't know the answer, but I suspect that they were able to use sign language to understand, because it is, after all, an art. It's a craft, and you don't need to speak a language to know what a right angle is or a plumb line.
I know foremen who still to this day communicate mainly in sign language, although it's usually less than polite.
Yeah, well, I suppose you could invert the compasses and get something along those lines.
That was quick. Brilliant. The last one here was Ian Grimble.
Ian.
Conrad, many thanks. Excellent. Just a quickie, really. Did early Royal Arch have those elements that are still in Scottish Royal Arch? I'm thinking of passing of the veils and the burning bush.
I don't know, Ian, is the straight answer. I know that the early Royal Arch was Christian, and that's why you see the symbols of the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. The veils, yeah, that's a peculiar Bristol thing. But the burning of the bush, well, really, we're into Royal Arch territory here, and I've been asked by Gareth and others to talk about Royal Arch separately. So yeah, you'll have to wait for that one, Ian, before I'm able
dampen your own fire too soon. Yeah.
To answer that. What I would say, though, is that if you look at the arms of UGLE, you can see the four evangelists there. They've been de-Christianized now, but you've got the lion, the eagle, the ox, and the man. But at the very top of the arms is the Ark of the Covenant. So next time, have a look at the arms, and you will see there the Ark of the Covenant with the poles that were carried across the desert. And above the arms, above the Ark of the Covenant, is in Hebrew, holiness to the Lord.
Oh, excellent. Thank you.
That's great. I won't offer any more questions. That's okay, because we're over time. But it was genuinely fascinating to hear that, Conrad, and thank you very, very, very much. We have recorded the session, and it will be available on the website very shortly. And don't forget the other things that we can do as an L&D team. We are here to, firstly, we have the monthly webinars, generally on the last working day of the month. This being an exception, because we really wanted to hear Conrad's presentation. Anyway, we also have the Learning and Development WhatsApp channel, which is growing in number. I'm hoping Steve's just dropped a QR code into the chat. He has. So if you're not a member of the Learning and Development WhatsApp channel, please scan that QR code and sign up. It's a message a week, maybe two. It's a one-way communication system, so you don't get the constant pinging that you get from WhatsApp groups that you're probably already members of. It's 1 or 2 pings a week, and it's usually something useful and will help you in like a daily advancement in Masonic knowledge. We're also available to support lodges. Firstly, with presentations, we can help with the tracing boards, followed by question and answer sessions, which are proving really, really popular. Secondly, with support to ritual. So if you're a smaller lodge and you're trying to grow, you may not have people within your lodge who can deliver the larger pieces of ritual. Let us know, and we will help where we can come along and deliver some of those pieces on your behalf to help you improve your membership. Again, thank you, Conrad. Really appreciate your time and effort. That was excellent. And I hope certainly the newer Masons on the call, hopefully you've it's scratched an itch that members of your lodge have been unable to scratch so far. And also, it would be remiss of me not to thank Steve Veal for all his hard work in the background in preparing these webinars. He does all the legwork and does a really, really good job. So thank you, Steve. And Ruben, thank you for covering at the start there. I was having some real serious Wi-Fi issues. I'm sat in a service station in Bridgewater as we speak. Excellent. Right. Enjoy your evening. Thanks once again, Conrad, and good night.